Admiral Catherine Thompson stood at the wrought-iron gates of her childhood home, staring at the balloon archway that spelled out, "Happy 75th Birthday, Dad," in silver and gold. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, addressed simply to Catherine, with no title, no acknowledgement of the 30 years she'd devoted to serving her country. Her younger brother Marcus had made it clear over the phone that her presence was tolerated, not celebrated, and that she shouldn't expect any special treatment just because she wore stars on her shoulders. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sprawling colonial house in Savannah looked exactly as she remembered, with its pristine white columns and manicured rose gardens that her stepmother Patricia had obsessed over for the past 15 years. Cars lined the circular driveway, expensive sedans and luxury SUVs that belonged to her father's business associates, old family friends and relatives who had gradually stopped calling her by name years ago. Through the tall windows, she could see the warm glow of the party already in full swing, elegant figures moving about with champagne glasses and practiced smiles. Catherine adjusted the simple navy blazer she had chosen for the occasion. No uniform today. She'd learned that lesson the hard way at her father's retirement party 5 years earlier, when Patricia had loudly whispered to the hostess that some people just can't let go of playing dress-up. The comment had cut deeper than any enemy fire she'd faced in 3 different combat zones. The relationship with her family had fractured slowly, like a foundation settling over time until the cracks became too wide to ignore. It started when she'd chosen the Naval Academy over the prestigious law school her father had attended. "You're throwing away your potential," he'd said, as if her desire to serve meant she was somehow diminishing herself. Her stepmother had been even more direct, suggesting that Catherine was running away from real responsibility by choosing military life. When Catherine had earned her first promotion to lieutenant, the family dinner celebrating the achievement had lasted exactly 27 minutes before the conversation shifted to Marcus's new position at their father's investment firm. When she'd been selected for her first command at sea, her father had told people she was doing some sort of Navy administrative work. When she'd received her admiral's stars, becoming one of the youngest female admirals in Marine Corps history, the Christmas card that year had listed her simply as Catherine, still traveling. The pattern had become as predictable as it was painful. Her achievements were minimized, her service downplayed, her sacrifices treated as inconveniences that interfered with family gatherings and social events. When she'd missed Marcus's wedding due to a deployment in the South China Sea, coordinating humanitarian relief efforts after a devastating typhoon, her absence had been described as Catherine choosing work over family again. She walked up the familiar brick pathway past the fountain where she used to float paper boats as a child, dreaming of commanding real ships someday. The dreams had come true, but the little girl who'd shared them with her father seemed to belong to someone else's memory now. The front door opened before she could ring the bell. Marcus appeared, looking polished in his tailored suit and practiced smile. At 42, he'd inherited their father's height and commanding presence, though he'd never commanded anything more challenging than a boardroom presentation. "Catherine," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "You made it." "Happy birthday to Dad," she replied, noting how he stepped aside just enough to let her pass, but not enough to seem welcoming. The foyer buzzed with conversation and laughter. She recognized some faces from her childhood, neighbors and family friends who had watched her grow up, who had cheered when she'd been accepted to the academy. Now they glanced at her with polite recognition before turning back to their conversations about golf handicaps and vacation homes. Her father stood near the fireplace, surrounded by a circle of admirers listening to one of his famous stories about closing a difficult business deal. At 75, James Thompson still commanded a room with the same confidence that had built his commercial real estate empire. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his burgundy jacket immaculate, his laugh rich and genuine. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment his face brightened with something that might have been pride. "There's my daughter," he announced to the group, though his voice carried a subtle note of obligation rather than joy. "Catherine's been busy with her Navy career." "Marine Corps, Dad," she corrected gently, as she had countless times before. "Right, of course," he said, though she could see he'd already forgotten again. "All that military business." The circle of listeners nodded politely, but she could feel their attention drifting. In their world of country clubs and charity galas, her service record was an abstract concept, something that happened far away to other people's children. They understood success in terms of portfolio growth and social standing, not in terms of missions accomplished or lives saved. Patricia materialized beside her father, resplendent in silk dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She'd maintained her beauty through careful attention and expensive procedures, and she wore her role as the perfect hostess like armor. "Catherine, how lovely," Patricia said, her smile as sharp as cut crystal. "You look so rested. I suppose all that time at sea is like an extended vacation." The comment landed with surgical precision. Patricia had always possessed an uncanny ability to reduce Catherine's most challenging assignments to something trivial, something that required no real skill or sacrifice. A deployment to the Persian Gulf became a cruise. Leading a task force through a humanitarian crisis became travel opportunities. Earning the respect of hardened Marines became playing with the boys. "Something like that," she replied, refusing to take the bait. The conversation flowed around her as she stood on the periphery of her own family gathering. She listened to Marcus describe his latest acquisition, a tech startup that promised to revolutionize something she didn't quite understand. She heard her father's business partners discuss market trends and investment strategies with the intensity that she reserved for strategic military planning. She watched her young niece and nephew, Marcus's children, race through the crowd with their grandmother's gentle scolding following behind them. Everyone had a place in this choreographed celebration, except her. She was the extra guest, the one whose attendance was noted but not necessary, whose absence would probably make the evening flow more smoothly. As the evening progressed, the subtle slights accumulated like small cuts. When someone asked about her career, the conversation quickly shifted to Marcus's recent promotion to vice president. When she mentioned her current assignment at Marine Corps headquarters, Patricia suggested she must enjoy all that paperwork. When someone complimented her on staying in shape, her father joked that the military keeps her busy with calisthenics. Each comment was carefully calibrated to diminish without appearing cruel, to minimize without seeming intentional. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts delivered with smiles and wrapped in family affection. The moment that would define the evening came during the toasts. Marcus stood up, tapping his champagne flute with a silver spoon, commanding attention with the same natural authority their father possessed. The room quieted, faces turning toward him with genuine interest and affection. "I'd like to say a few words about the man we're here to celebrate tonight," Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Our father, James Thompson, who taught us that success comes from hard work, dedication, and never giving up on your dreams." Catherine felt a flutter of hope. Perhaps this would be the moment when Marcus acknowledged her service, when the family publicly recognized what she had accomplished in her own right. Perhaps he would mention that their father had raised not one, but two successful children, that her daughter had achieved something remarkable in her own right. "Dad showed me how to build something lasting," Marcus continued, "how to create value and leave a legacy. He taught me that family comes first, that the people who really matter are the ones who stand by you through everything." The hope began to curdle in her chest. "Tonight, I want to thank him for being not just a father, but a mentor and friend. And I want to thank everyone here who has been part of our journey, who has supported our family through all the years." Marcus raised his glass higher. "To James Thompson, a man who built an empire and raised a son to carry it forward." The room erupted in applause and cheers. Catherine stood frozen, her champagne glass halfway to her lips, as the reality of the moment crashed over her. In her brother's carefully crafted toast, in this room of people who had known her since childhood, she had simply ceased to exist. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face as the applause thundered around her. She stood motionless in the center of the celebrating crowd, invisible despite being surrounded by dozens of people. The champagne in her glass trembled slightly, the only outward sign of the earthquake happening inside her chest. "Wonderful speech," Patricia murmured as she glided past, her voice carrying just enough volume for Catherine to hear. "What matters most to the family?" The message was clear. Catherine never mattered most. Perhaps she had never mattered at all. She considered leaving.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The logical part of her mind, the part trained to assess situations and extract personnel when missions became untenable, urged her to walk away with whatever dignity remained intact. But something deeper held her in place, a stubborn core of steel that had carried her through impossible situations before. Her father was accepting congratulations near the fireplace, beaming with pride as guest after guest praised Marcus's heartfelt words. When he caught sight of Catherine standing alone by the windows, he approached with the careful smile of someone fulfilling a social obligation. "Kathy," he said, using the childhood nickname that felt wrong in his mouth now. "You've been awfully quiet tonight." "Just listening, Dad. It's a beautiful party." Patricia outdid herself with the planning. He glanced around the room with satisfaction. "Marcus gave quite a speech, didn't he? That boy has a real gift for words." That boy. Marcus was 42 years old, a successful executive, a father of 2. But he would always be that boy, with the gift for words, while Catherine remained simply present, unremarkable, easy to overlook. "He did," she agreed quietly. Her father steadied her face for a moment, and she wondered if he could see the hurt she was trying so hard to conceal. For just an instant, his expression softened, and she glimpsed the man who used to read her bedtime stories and teach her to throw a perfect spiral in the backyard. "You know, sweetheart," he said, lowering his voice, "I'm proud of what you've accomplished. It's just that your world and ours are so different. Sometimes it's hard for people to understand what you do out there." The words were meant as comfort, but they stung worse than outright dismissal. He was essentially telling her that her service was too complex, too foreign for his sophisticated guests to comprehend, as if leading Marines through combat operations was somehow more abstract than negotiating commercial leases. "I understand, Dad," she said, "because arguing would only make things worse. That's my girl." He patted her shoulder and moved away, drawn back into conversations about things that mattered in his world. Catherine retreated to the library, a quiet room lined with leather-bound books that her father collected but never read. She needed a moment to compose herself, to rebuild the walls that kept her emotions contained during difficult operations. Through the tall windows, she could see the garden where she'd played as a child, where she'd once told her father she wanted to be a soldier when she grew up. He'd laughed and said she'd change her mind when she got older and realized what really mattered. She'd never changed her mind, but apparently he'd never changed his either. The sound of vehicles pulling into the driveway drew her attention. Through the window, she watched 3 black SUVs arrive in perfect formation, their movements precise and coordinated. Military vehicles. Her heart rate quickened as she recognized the distinctive bearing of the men emerging from the cars. Marines. Active duty from their posture and the way they moved together as a unit. But why would Marines be arriving at her father's birthday party? The front door chimed, and she heard Patricia's voice rise with confusion and slight irritation. "I'm sorry, but this is a private family celebration. I think you may have the wrong address." "Ma'am, we're looking for Admiral Catherine Thompson. We have reason to believe she's attending this gathering." Catherine's blood turned to ice water. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Marines didn't show up at civilian parties unless there was an emergency, unless someone was dead, or missing, or captured. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. She moved quickly through the house, pushing past startled guests who had begun to cluster near the foyer. The party's cheerful buzz had died, replaced with an uncomfortable tension as formally dressed civilians found themselves face-to-face with Marines in their dress blue uniforms. "I'm Admiral Thompson," she announced as she reached the entryway. The lead Marine, a gunnery sergeant with 3 rows of ribbons and eyes that had seen serious action, stepped forward. Behind him stood 5 other Marines, their formation perfect despite the civilian setting. She recognized the look immediately. Honor Guard. These were Marines selected for their exemplary service and bearing, the ones chosen to represent the Corps at the most solemn ceremonies. "Admiral Thompson," the gunnery sergeant said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent foyer. "I'm Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez. We've been trying to reach you through official channels, ma'am, but your personal security team redirected us here." Personal security team? Catherine felt confusion mixed with growing dread. "Sergeant, I don't have a personal security team. What's this about?" Rodriguez's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and Catherine caught something that looked like surprise, followed quickly by what might have been anger. "Ma'am, with respect, we were told you'd been briefed. The ceremony is scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. "What ceremony?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Catherine could feel her family and their guests pressing closer, drawn by curiosity and the magnetic presence of the Marines. Her father had moved to the front of the crowd, his businessman's instinct for reading important situations overriding his confusion. Rodriguez glanced at his men, then back at Catherine. She could see him making a decision, weighing protocols against circumstances, choosing his words carefully. "Ma'am, the president has signed the orders. The ceremony at Quantico was supposed to be private, per your family's request, but the media got wind of it. That's why we're here, to escort you personally." "What orders?" Catherine's voice came out hoarse. "The Presidential Unit Citation, Admiral, for Operation Lighthouse, the one you commanded in the Solomon Islands." Rodriguez's voice grew stronger, more formal. "The one where you saved 375 civilians from that Category 5 hurricane under hostile fire from insurgent forces." The foyer fell into absolute silence. Catherine felt the world tilt sideways as memories crashed over her. Operation Lighthouse, 18 months ago. The nightmare mission that had nearly killed her and the Marines under her command. The classified operation that officially never happened, that she'd never been allowed to discuss even with her family. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. "No mistake, ma'am." Rodriguez reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick envelope bearing official seals. "The president's letter specifically commends your leadership during the 72-hour siege. Says you held that evacuation zone against overwhelming odds while coordinating the rescue of civilians from 14 different nations."
I began, then stopped. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since arriving. "Your Marines, ma'am. Every single one of them who survived Lighthouse. They got together, put together the nomination package. Took them 8 months to get the classification levels cleared for review. But they wouldn't quit. Said you deserved better than a secret commendation in some file cabinet." The envelope felt impossibly heavy in her hands. Behind her, she could hear her father asking someone in a bewildered whisper, "What's the Presidential Unit Citation? Is that important?" One of the younger Marines, a corporal with bright eyes and a slight Southern accent, stepped forward. "Admiral, if I may, Operation Lighthouse was when you held that beach for 3 days straight while we evacuated those villages. You hadn't slept in 60 hours. You were running on caffeine and determination, and you still personally carried wounded civilians to the landing craft. You saved my life twice in 1 day, ma'am. Once when you pulled me out from under that collapsed pier, and once when you talked me through defusing that IED when the EOD team couldn't reach us." Catherine remembered him now. Corporal Stevens, from Tennessee, barely 20 years old when they'd been deployed to the Solomon Islands. She'd found him trapped under concrete and steel while insurgent forces closed in on their position. Getting him free had cost them precious time and exposed them to enemy fire, but leaving him behind had never been an option. "You told me that Marines don't leave Marines behind," Stephens continued, his young voice carrying across the elegant foyer filled with people in evening clothes. "But it wasn't just Marines you wouldn't leave behind, ma'am. It was anybody who needed help." Patricia's voice cut through the moment like broken glass. "This is all very impressive, but surely this could have waited until after the party. This is hardly the appropriate venue for military business." Rodriguez turned toward her with the kind of look that could freeze lava. When he spoke, his voice held the barely controlled fury of a professional warrior who'd just heard someone dismiss the highest honor his country could bestow. "Ma'am, with all due respect, when the President of the United States decides to personally recognize someone for extraordinary heroism, there is no inappropriate venue. There is only the appropriate level of respect. He turned back to Catherine, his voice softening. Admiral, we have a helicopter standing by. The president is waiting at Quantico. The entire Joint Chiefs will be there. This isn't just about you, ma'am. This is about every Marine who served under your command, every civilian you saved, every family that got to go home because you decided that your mission was to protect people, not just follow orders. Catherine looked around the foyer at the faces staring back at her. Her father looked stunned, as if he was seeing her for the first time. Marcus appeared pale and shaken, his earlier confidence evaporating as the reality of what he was witnessing sank in. Patricia stood rigid with barely concealed fury, her perfect party disrupted by inconvenient truths. But it was the faces of the Marines that held her attention. These young men who had volunteered to come here, who had tracked her down at a private family gathering, who had spent months navigating bureaucracy and classification levels just to ensure she received the recognition she deserved. "How long do I have to get ready?" she asked quietly. "We can wait as long as you need, Admiral, but the president's schedule is tight and there are a lot of people who want to shake your hand tonight." Catherine nodded slowly, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest. For 30 years, she'd served in silence, accepting that her family would never understand the weight of what she carried. She'd convinced herself that their approval didn't matter, that duty was its own reward. But standing here, surrounded by Marines who had refused to let her service disappear into classified files and bureaucratic silence, she realized she'd been wrong about something important. She didn't need her family's approval, but she deserved the nation's recognition, and more importantly, she deserved to accept it with pride. "I need 15 minutes to get ready," she said quietly. "We can wait as long as you need, Admiral, but the president's schedule is tight and there are a lot of people who want to shake your hand tonight." Catherine nodded slowly, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest. For 30 years, she'd served in silence, accepting that her family would never understand the weight of what she carried. She'd convinced herself that their approval didn't matter, that duty was its own reward. But standing here, surrounded by Marines who had refused to let her service disappear into classified files and bureaucratic silence, she realized she'd been wrong about something important. She didn't need her family's approval, but she deserved the nation's recognition, and more importantly, she deserved to accept it with pride. "I need 15 minutes to change," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around her. As she turned toward the staircase leading to the guest rooms, her father stepped forward, his face a mixture of confusion and something that might have been belated pride. "Catherine, wait. I don't understand what's happening here. The president? The Solomon Islands? You never told us about any mission." She paused on the bottom step, her hand resting on the polished mahogany banister. "It was classified, Dad. I couldn't tell you." "But surely now," he gestured helplessly at the Marine standing at attention in his foyer, "this seems rather important." The understatement hung in the air like incense. Rather important. The Presidential Unit citation was the highest honor that could be bestowed on a military unit, equivalent to the Medal of Honor for individual service. Men and women spent entire careers hoping for such recognition, and her father thought it seemed rather important. Patricia's voice cut through the moment like broken glass. "This is all very impressive, but surely this could have waited until after the party. This is hardly the appropriate venue for military business." Rodriguez turned toward her with the kind of look that could freeze lava. When he spoke, his voice held the barely controlled fury of a professional warrior who just heard someone dismiss the highest honor his country could bestow. "Ma'am, with all due respect, when the President of the United States decides to personally recognize someone for extraordinary heroism, there is no inappropriate venue. There is only the appropriate level of respect." He turned back to Catherine, his voice softening. "Admiral, we have a helicopter standing by. The president is waiting at Quantico. The entire Joint Chiefs will be there. This isn't just about you, ma'am. This is about every Marine who served under your command, every civilian you saved, every family that got to go home because you decided that your mission was to protect people, not just follow orders." Catherine looked around the foyer at the faces staring back at her. Her father looked stunned, as if he was seeing her for the first time. Marcus appeared pale and shaken, his earlier confidence evaporating as the reality of what he was witnessing sank in. Patricia stood rigid with barely concealed fury, her perfect party disrupted by inconvenient truths. But it was the faces of the Marines that held her attention. These young men who had volunteered to come here, who had tracked her down at a private family gathering, who had spent months navigating bureaucracy and classification levels just to ensure she received the recognition she deserved. "How long do I have to get ready?" she asked quietly. "We can wait as long as you need, Admiral, but the president's schedule is tight and there are a lot of people who want to shake your hand tonight." Catherine nodded slowly, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest. For 30 years, she'd served in silence, accepting that her family would never understand the weight of what she carried. She'd convinced herself that their approval didn't matter, that duty was its own reward. But standing here, surrounded by Marines who had refused to let her service disappear into classified files and bureaucratic silence, she realized she'd been wrong about something important. She didn't need her family's approval, but she deserved the nation's recognition, and more importantly, she deserved to accept it with pride.
Honor wasn't something you could postpone for convenience. Marcus stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Catherine, this is incredible. I mean, the president? We had no idea you were involved in anything this significant." "You never asked?" she said quietly. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the gathered crowd. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, perhaps finally understanding the years of silence between them. Her father moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "Sweetheart, I'm sorry. I know we haven't always understood your career, but this changes things. When you get back from the ceremony, we'll sit down and talk properly. You can tell us everything." Catherine studied his face, seeing genuine regret mixed with the dawning realization of what he'd failed to recognize in his own daughter. Part of her wanted to accept the olive branch, to believe that this moment could bridge the gap that had widened over decades. But she'd learned something important in her years of service. Real respect couldn't be retroactively applied. It had to be present from the beginning. Or it wasn't respect at all. It was just guilt disguised as admiration. "Dad," she said gently, "you don't get to be proud of me now because other people validated what I've been doing all along. Either you believed in me when it was hard, or you didn't." His face crumpled slightly, the words hitting their mark with devastating accuracy. "But we're family, Catherine. Family forgives. Family moves forward. Family also shows up," she replied. "Family asks questions. Family doesn't wait for presidential recognition to notice that someone they love has been serving their country with distinction for 30 years. She turned to Rodriguez. "Sergeant, I'll be ready in 10 minutes. As she climbed the stairs, she could hear the uncomfortable murmur of voices behind her. Her family's guests, who had come to celebrate a successful businessman's 75th birthday, now found themselves witnessing something they couldn't quite comprehend. The woman they'd overlooked, the quiet daughter who rarely spoke at family gatherings, was apparently important enough to command the personal attention of the President of the United States. In the guest bedroom that had been hers as a child, Catherine opened the small overnight bag she'd brought, knowing she might not want to stay the night after the party. She pulled out her dress blue uniform, the one she'd packed on instinct, the way a soldier always packs for contingencies. The uniform was perfect, pressed and ready. The ribbons and decorations arranged with mathematical precision. She'd earned every piece of metal and fabric through blood, sweat, and decisions that haunted her sleep. The silver star from Afghanistan, the bronze star with V device from Iraq, the Navy Cross from Somalia,
the Purple Heart from a mission she still couldn't discuss. As she changed clothes, she could see her reflection in the antique mirror that had belonged to her grandmother. The woman looking back at her wasn't the uncertain girl who'd left for the Naval Academy 35 years ago. This was Admiral Catherine Thompson, a Marine who'd commanded respect from the fiercest warriors in the world. The sound of voices drifted up from below. She could hear Patricia's angry whisper, her father's confused questions, Marcus trying to manage the social disaster unfolding in their foyer. But she could also hear something else, the steady, professional voices of Marines who'd come to honor one of their own. When she descended the stairs 15 minutes later, the effect was electric. The scattered conversations died as every eye in the room turned toward her. In her dress blues, with her ribbons catching the light and her silver stars gleaming on her shoulders, she looked like exactly what she was, a warrior who'd earned her place through fire and steel. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Outstanding, Admiral. The helicopter is standing by." As they moved toward the door, her father caught her arm gently. "Catherine, when will you be back? When can we have that conversation?" She looked at him for a long moment, seeing the man who'd taught her to ride a bicycle and helped with her homework, but also the man who'd spent decades dismissing her accomplishments because they didn't fit his definition of success. "Dad," she said gently, "you don't get to be proud of me now because other people validated what I've been doing all along. Either you believed in me when it was hard, or you didn't." His face crumpled slightly, the words hitting their mark with devastating accuracy. "But we're family, Catherine. Family forgives. Family moves forward. Family also shows up," she replied. "Family asks questions. Family doesn't wait for presidential recognition to notice that someone they love has been serving their country with distinction for 30 years. She turned to Rodriguez. "Sergeant, I'll be ready in 10 minutes. As they walked toward the door, Catherine felt the weight of 30 years lifting from her shoulders. Behind her, she could hear her family scrambling to process what had just happened, could hear guests whispering questions they should have asked years ago. But she didn't look back. The helicopter ride to Quantico gave her time to think, to process the magnitude of what was happening. Through the aircraft's windows, she could see the lights of Washington spreading out below them, the city where decisions were made that affected millions of lives around the world. At Quantico, she was met by the Commandant of the Marine Corps himself, along with the Secretary of Defense and a small army of officials whose faces she recognized from news broadcasts. The ceremony was held in a historic hall, lined with portraits of Marine heroes from every era. When the president pinned the Presidential Unit citation to her uniform, his words carried across the assembled crowd of Marines, family members of her unit, and media representatives who would carry the story to the world. "Admiral Thompson," he said, his voice clear and strong, "your actions during Operation Lighthouse represent the very best of American military leadership. Under impossible conditions, facing overwhelming odds, you chose to protect the innocent rather than preserve your own safety. 347 people are alive today because you and your Marines refused to abandon them." The applause that followed wasn't the polite clapping of a society gathering. It was the thunderous appreciation of people who understood what sacrifice meant, what honor looked like when it was tested by fire. Later, at the reception, she was approached by a young captain whose face she didn't recognize. "Admiral," he said, "I wanted to thank you. My sister was one of the aid workers you evacuated from the Solomon Islands. She's getting married next month, and she asked me to tell you that you're invited. She said she owes you her future." These were the moments that mattered. Not the society pages or family approval, but the quiet knowledge that her service had meaning, that her choices had allowed other people to live and love and build families of their own. 6 months later, Catherine stood on the deck of her new home, overlooking at Chesapeake Bay, watching the morning sun paint the water gold. She'd retired from active duty after the ceremony, accepting a position with a veterans organization that helped military families navigate the challenges of service life. Her work focused on family reconciliation, helping bridge the gap between military service members and relatives who didn't understand the weight of what their loved ones carried. She knew that divide intimately, had lived on both sides of it.
Her father called occasionally now, awkward conversations where he tried to rebuild bridges that had been burning for decades. She was polite, but distant, willing to listen but no longer willing to pretend that recognition could be retroactively applied to heal years of neglect. Marcus had written her a long letter after the ceremony, acknowledging his own role in her isolation and expressing genuine regret. She'd written back a brief note thanking him for his honesty, but explaining that some distances couldn't be closed with apologies alone. The young Marines from the ceremony stayed in touch, sending updates from their deployments and career milestones. They'd given her something her family never had, the understanding that some forms of service transcended social expectations and demanded recognition on their own terms. Standing on her deck with her morning coffee, watching fishing boats head out into the bay, Catherine realized she'd finally found what she'd been searching for all her life. Not approval from people who'd never understood her choices, but peace with the woman she'd chosen to become. She'd spent 30 years serving her country with distinction. She'd saved lives, led Marines through impossible situations, and earned the respect of warriors and presidents alike. And for the first time in her adult life, that was enough. The news coverage began the morning after the ceremony. Catherine woke in her hotel room near Quantico to find her phone buzzing with notifications from news alerts, social media mentions, and messages from people she hadn't heard from in years. The Presidential Unit Citation Ceremony had been covered by every major network, and the story of the overlooked daughter who became a decorated admiral was spreading across the internet like wildfire. The headlines varied in their approach, but the core narrative remained consistent. Family discovers daughter's heroism at birthday party. Admiral's parents learn of presidential citation from Marines at door. The quiet hero who saved 347 lives while family dismissed her service. The most thorough piece came from a veteran military journalist who had spent the night interviewing Marines from Operation Lighthouse. The article painted a detailed picture of the 72-hour siege, Catherine's leadership under impossible conditions, and the extraordinary fact that her own family had known nothing about the mission that would define her legacy. One quote from Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez particularly stung. Admiral Thompson never talked about her family, but we all assumed they were proud. Learning that they'd never even asked about her service, that they thought military life was just an extended vacation, that hit us hard. This woman bled for strangers while her own blood couldn't be bothered to understand what she did for a living. Catherine read the coverage with a mixture of vindication and sadness. She'd never wanted her family's ignorance exposed publicly, but she couldn't deny a certain satisfaction in watching the world learn what they'd chosen to overlook. Her phone rang continuously throughout the morning. Interview requests from national television programs, calls from military advocacy groups, messages from veterans who recognized their own family struggles in her story. But the call that made her stomach clench came from Marcus. "Catherine, we need to talk." His voice was strained, exhausted. "This media attention, it's getting out of hand. Patricia is furious, Dad is confused, and the whole family is under scrutiny. Can't you make a statement asking for privacy? Something to calm this down?" The request was so predictable it was almost funny. Once again, her family wanted her to manage the consequences of their own actions, to minimize the fallout from their decades of dismissal and neglect. "Marcus, I didn't create the situation. You did. All of you. For 30 years. But surely you can understand our position. We didn't know how important your work was. If you'd just explained better, maybe we would have understood." The words revealed everything wrong with their relationship in one sentence. It was her fault for not explaining better, not their fault for never asking. She was responsible for their ignorance, not them for choosing to remain ignorant. "I have to go." she said, ending the call. 3 days later, she received a formal letter from her father's attorney. The family was requesting that she cease all media appearances and public statements related to the ceremony. They cited potential damage to her father's business reputation and suggested that continued attention could harm family relationships irreparably. Catherine read the letter twice, then filed it in her desk drawer next to the commendation from the president. The contrast was stark. On one side, recognition from the highest levels of government for extraordinary service. On the other, a legal threat from her own family for accepting that recognition too publicly. 2 weeks after the ceremony, she received an unexpected visitor at her temporary quarters. Patricia stood at her door looking immaculate as always, but Catherine could see the strain around her eyes, the careful way she held herself that suggested someone barely maintaining control. "May I come in?" Patricia asked, her voice uncharacteristically subdued. Catherine stepped aside, gesturing toward the small sitting area near the window. They sat in silence for a moment. Two women who had never understood each other, now facing the wreckage of years of mutual antagonism. "The media attention has been difficult," Patricia began, her voice carefully chosen. "Your father's business associates are asking questions. The country club is buzzing with gossip. People are looking at us differently." "How are they looking at you?" Catherine asked. Patricia's composure cracked slightly. "Like we're the people who didn't recognize a hero in our own family. Like we're the villains in some patriotic fairy tale." The admission hung between them, honest in a way Patricia had never been before. For the first time, Catherine saw her stepmother not as a social climber protecting her territory, but a woman confronting the consequences of choices she'd never thought would matter. "The worst part," Patricia continued, "is that they're not wrong. I did dismiss you. I did think your military service was somehow less important than Marcus's business career. I thought social standing mattered more than actual achievement." Catherine studied her stepmother's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but finding only exhaustion and genuine regret. "Why?" Catherine asked. "Why was it so important to diminish what I did?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the training grounds where young Marines were learning to become warriors. "Because you made the rest of us look small," she said finally. "Not intentionally, but just by being who you are. When you walked into a room in uniform, people straightened up. They paid attention. They showed respect in a way they never did for Marcus's business accomplishments or my charity work." She turned to meet Catherine's eyes. "I spent 20 years building a social position in this town, creating the perfect family image, managing every detail to project success and stability, and then you'd come home from some deployment and suddenly none of that mattered. You had real authority, real respect, real accomplishment. It made everything else feel like playing dress-up." The honesty was brutal and unexpected. Catherine had always assumed Patricia's hostility came from simple snobbery, the need to maintain social hierarchies. She'd never considered that it might stem from a deeper insecurity, a recognition that military service carried a moral weight that civilian achievements couldn't match. "So you decided to make me invisible," Catherine said. "I decided to protect what I'd built," Patricia replied. "I told myself that minimizing your accomplishments was just maintaining balance in the family, making sure Marcus didn't feel overshadowed. But really, I was protecting myself from feeling overshadowed." They sat in silence again, the weight of 30 years of misunderstanding settling between them. "I can't undo what I did," Patricia said eventually.
I can't go back and ask about your deployments or celebrate your promotions or treat your service with the respect it deserved. But I can tell you that I understand now what we lost. Not just your presence at family events, but the chance to be proud of something genuinely worth admiring.
Catherine felt something ease in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of relief at finally understanding the dynamics that had shaped their relationship. "What do you want from me now?" Catherine asked. "Nothing," Patricia said, surprising her. "I didn't come here to ask for anything. I came to acknowledge what I did, and to tell you that watching those Marines honor you was the first time I truly understood who you are. I'm sorry it took 30 years and a presidential citation for me to see clearly." After Patricia left, Catherine sat alone in her quarters thinking about the conversation. The apology didn't erase the years of dismissal, didn't heal the wounds left by decades of being erased from her own family's narrative, but it did provide something she hadn't expected, an explanation that made sense of the senseless. Over the following months, the media attention gradually faded, but the impact of Catherine's story continued to resonate. She received hundreds of letters from military families dealing with similar dynamics, from service members whose achievements were minimized by relatives who couldn't understand the weight of what they carried. The stories were heartbreakingly familiar. A Navy pilot whose parents told people she drove boats for the government. An Army doctor whose family thought he was playing soldier instead of pursuing a real medical career. A Marine sergeant whose wedding invitation listed him as unemployed because his civilian relatives didn't consider military service a legitimate job. Each letter reinforced Catherine's growing conviction that her experience wasn't isolated, that families across the country were struggling with the disconnect between military service and civilian understanding. She began accepting speaking engagements, not to relitigate her family's failures, but to address the broader issue of how military families could bridge the gap between service and civilian life. Her presentations focused on education and communication, helping both service members and their families understand each other's perspectives. The work was fulfilling in a way that surprised her. For 30 years, she'd served her country directly, leading Marines and protecting civilians in combat zones around the world. Now she was serving differently, helping heal the quiet battles fought in living rooms and at dinner tables across America. 1 year after the ceremony, she received a call from Corporal Stevens, the young Marine from Tennessee who'd spoken up at her father's birthday party. He was getting married, he told her, and his fiancée had insisted on inviting Admiral Thompson to the wedding. She said anyone brave enough to face down your family and their own house deserves a place at our table, Stevens laughed. Plus, she wants to meet the woman who saved my sorry hide in the Solomon Islands. Catherine accepted the invitation and found herself at a small ceremony in rural Tennessee, surrounded by Marines, their families, and civilians who understood that service came in many forms. When Stevens introduced her to his bride, the young woman hugged her tightly and whispered, "Thank you for bringing him home." These were the moments that mattered now. Not the recognition from presidents or the media attention, but the quiet acknowledgement from people who understood what sacrifice meant, who valued service over social standing. Catherine had spent most of her adult life seeking approval from people who were incapable of understanding what she had dedicated her life to protecting. Now, surrounded by those who did understand, she realized she'd finally found her real family. Not the one she'd been born into, but the one she'd chosen through service, sacrifice, and the bonds forged in the crucible of protecting others. The birthday party that had started as another exercise in family disappointment had become the catalyst for a different kind of recognition, a different kind of belonging. And for the first time in her adult life, Catherine Thompson felt truly at home. 5 years had passed since the Night Marines appeared at her father's birthday party, and Catherine Thompson had built a life that would have been unimaginable during those dark years of family rejection. The Veterans Family Reconciliation Center she'd founded now operated in 12 states, helping thousands of military families navigate the complex terrain between service and civilian understanding.
Her days were filled with purpose in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. The same strategic thinking she'd applied to military operations now went toward designing programs that helped bridge cultural divides. The same leadership skills that had guided Marines through combat zones now helped traumatized families find their way back to each other. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent 30 years trying to earn recognition from her own family, only to find her true calling in helping other families heal from similar wounds. On a crisp October morning, Catherine stood in the conference room of her Virginia headquarters addressing a group of newly graduated counselors who would be deployed to military bases across the country. These were mostly veterans themselves, men and women who understood intimately the challenge of translating military experience into civilian language. "Remember," she told them, "the goal isn't to make families agree on everything. The goal is to help them understand each other's reality. When a Marine mother says her deployment was just doing her job, and her civilian parents hear that as diminishing her service, both sides are missing something important." She paused, looking at faces that reflected her own journey of discovery. The Marine is protecting her family from the weight of what she carried. The parents are trying to minimize something that seems too large and frightening to comprehend. Our job is to help them find a middle ground where truth and love can coexist. After the session, Catherine retreated to her office, a space that reflected the life she'd built for herself. Military commendations hung alongside civilian awards for her reconciliation work. Photos of Marines she'd served with shared wall space with pictures of families who'd found healing through her programs. The view from her window overlooked the Potomac River, where she often saw military vessels moving with purposeful precision. It reminded her daily that the work of protecting democracy continued, carried out by young men and women whose families might never fully understand the weight they carried. Her assistant knocked and entered with the day's mail. Among the usual correspondence was a thick envelope bearing the return address she'd memorized, but hadn't seen in over 2 years. Her father's law firm. She opened it carefully, unsure what to expect. Inside was a formal legal document, but not the cease and desist order she might have anticipated years earlier. Instead, it was a trust agreement establishing the Catherine Thompson Foundation for Military Family Support, funded by a substantial endowment from her father's estate. The accompanying letter was in her father's handwriting, shaky now, but still recognizable. "Catherine," it began, "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness after a lifetime of failing to see you clearly. The doctors tell me I have perhaps 6 months, and I've spent these final weeks trying to understand how I raised a daughter who became a hero while I remained blind to her greatness. I've read everything about Operation Lighthouse, spoken with veterans who served under your command, and tried to comprehend the magnitude of what you accomplished not just in the Solomon Islands, but throughout your career. The picture that emerges is of a woman whose courage and leadership saved countless lives, while her own father couldn't be bothered to ask about her work. I can't undo 30 years of neglect, but I can ensure that other military families receive the support mine failed to provide. The foundation is my attempt to honor not just your service, but the service of all those whose families struggle to understand their sacrifice. I don't expect you to visit. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I needed you to know that I finally see you, and I'm proud beyond words of the woman you became despite my failures as a father." Catherine read the letter 3 times, feeling emotions she thought were permanently buried, rising to the surface. The financial gift was generous beyond anything she'd imagined, enough to expand her work exponentially. But it was the acknowledgment that moved her most deeply, the simple statement that he finally saw her. She sat in silence for a long time, watching the river flow past her window, thinking about forgiveness and redemption, and the strange ways that understanding sometimes arrive too late to heal relationships, but just in time to heal hearts. That evening, she drove to Savannah for the first time in 5 years. The house looked smaller than she remembered, less imposing, as if time had reduced its power to intimidate her. The gardens were still immaculate, but she noticed details that had escaped her before.
the subtle signs of a house where perfection was maintained by professionals rather than lived by a family. Her father answered the door himself, moving slowly but without assistance. At 80, he looked fragile in a way that caught her off guard. The commanding presence that had dominated her childhood had been replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. "Catherine," he said, his voice carrying surprise and what might have been relief. "I didn't expect you to come. I got your letter," I said simply. He nodded, stepping aside to let her enter. The house smelled different now, less like Patricia's expensive perfumes and more like the antiseptic scent of medical equipment. His stepmother was nowhere to be seen. They sat in his study, a room lined with business awards and photographs of deals closed and buildings constructed. But I noticed new additions to the decor. Framed articles about her work, photos from the presidential ceremony, and what looked like a detailed timeline of her military career. "Patricia moved out 6 months ago," he said, following her gaze. "She said I couldn't watch me finally become the father I should have been 30 years ago. She was probably right."
There were 7 other missions where you saved lives under impossible conditions. 7 times where you chose to risk everything to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Catherine felt a familiar tightness in her chest. "Dad, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted, his voice stronger than she'd heard it all evening. "I need to say this while I still can. I raised a daughter who became everything a father should be proud of, and I spent 30 years being too small to recognize greatness when it lived in my own house." He opened the folder, revealing photographs, mission reports, testimonials from Marines and civilians whose lives she'd saved. "This researcher, Dr. Martinez, she told me something that's haunted me ever since. She said that in all her interviews with Marines who served under your command, not one of them had ever heard you mention family. Not once. She said most commanders talk about the people waiting for them at home, but you never did." The observation hit harder than Catherine had expected. She'd never realized how completely she'd compartmentalized her personal life, how thoroughly she'd protected her service from the contamination of family disappointment. "We weren't waiting for you, were we?" he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were the people you served in spite of, not the people you served for." The truth of it settled between them like smoke from a dying fire. Catherine had spent her career protecting American families, American values, American freedoms, while her own American family had actively worked to diminish her service. "I've been thinking about that night 5 years ago," her father said. "When those Marines came to the door looking for Admiral Thompson, I remember feeling confused, thinking there must be some mistake. The Admiral Thompson they were looking for sounded like someone important, someone whose presence mattered. It never occurred to me that my own daughter could be that person." He closed the folder carefully, as if it contained something precious and fragile. "I know it's too late to be the father you deserved. I know I can't reclaim 30 years of missed opportunities to show pride in your accomplishments. But I need you to know that I understand now what I lost, and it wasn't just your respect. I lost the privilege of being loved by someone worth loving." Catherine felt tears threatening for the first time in years, not tears of anger or frustration, but tears of grief for the relationship they'd never had, the father-daughter bond that had been sacrificed to pride and misunderstanding. "I forgive you," she said quietly, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "Not because you've earned it, but because carrying anger is too heavy, and I've carried enough weight for one lifetime." They talked until dawn, sharing stories that should have been told decades earlier. He asked about her deployments, her Marines, the weight of command decisions that affected other people's children. She told him about the loneliness of leadership, about making choices in combat zones while wondering if anyone at home would ever understand the cost of those decisions. As the sun rose over Savannah, Catherine realized that forgiveness didn't require forgetting. It didn't erase the years of dismissal or the pain of being invisible in her own family. but it did free her from the burden of carrying her father's failures as her own wounds. When she left that morning, they both understood that it would probably be their last conversation. But it was enough. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to close a circle that had been broken for too long. 3 months later, Catherine stood at her father's graveside, not as the excluded daughter, but as the honored veteran she'd always been. The funeral was different this time. Military honors were rendered with full ceremony. Her achievements were acknowledged in the eulogy. The American flag that draped his casket was presented to her, not as a gesture of obligation, but as recognition of her service. Marcus approached her after the ceremony, older now and carrying the weight of his own understanding. "I've been reading about your work, the Reconciliation Center, the families you've helped. I think I finally understand what Patricia meant when she said, 'You made the rest of us look small.' That was never the intention. I know. That's what made it worse. You weren't trying to overshadow anyone. You were just being yourself, and yourself happened to be remarkable." He handed her a business card. "I've been volunteering with veteran employment programs, helping translate military experience into civilian career opportunities. It's not much, but it's my way of trying to honor what you've been doing all along." Catherine studied the card, seeing her brother's name associated with veteran advocacy for the first time. "It's a start," she said, and meant it. The foundation established by her father's estate allowed Catherine to expand her work beyond anything she'd imagined possible. New centers opened across the country, staffed by counselors who understood both military culture and family dynamics. The programs evolved to address not just current conflicts between service members and their families, but the healing of relationships damaged by decades of misunderstanding. On the 10th anniversary of the presidential ceremony, Catherine was invited to speak at the Marine Corps War Memorial. The event honored not just her service, but the thousands of military families who'd found healing through the programs she'd created. As she stood before the iconic statue of Marines raising the flag at Iwo Jima, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who'd once stood invisible at her father's birthday party had become someone whose work touched military families across the nation. The speech she gave that day wasn't about her own journey from rejection to recognition. Instead, she focused on the families in the audience, the parents learning to understand their warrior children, the spouses bridging the gap between military and civilian worlds, the children discovering that their parents' service was something to be proud of rather than something that made them different. "Service doesn't end when the uniform comes off," she told them. "It continues in the relationships we build, the understanding we create, and the bridges we construct between different worlds. Every family that learns to honor military service while maintaining civilian connections is a victory for democracy itself." After the ceremony, Catherine was approached by a young Marine captain whose mother had participated in one of the reconciliation programs. "Admiral," she said, "my mom wanted me to tell you something. She said that before your program, she used to pray for me to come home safe. Now she prays for me to come home proud. She said learning to understand my service helped her understand herself better, too." These were the moments that validated everything Catherine had built. Not the recognition from presidents or the media attention, but the quiet transformations happening in living rooms and around dinner tables across America. As she drove home that evening, Catherine thought about the circle that had begun with Marines arriving at a birthday party and had led to thousands of military families finding their way back to each other. The woman who'd been erased from her own family story had become the author of countless other families' healing. Her phone buzzed with a text from Corporal Stevens, now Sergeant Stevens, sending photos from his daughter's first birthday party. The little girl was wearing a tiny Marine Corps t-shirt, surrounded by extended family who clearly understood that her father's service was something to be celebrated. Catherine smiled, remembering her own childhood birthday parties where her dreams of military service were dismissed as a phase she'd grow out of. The cycle had been broken. This little girl would grow up knowing that service was honorable, that protecting others was a calling worth respecting, that heroes sometimes came from your own family.
The foundation continued to grow, touching more lives each year, creating understanding where there had been division, building bridges where there had been walls. Catherine had found her true mission, not in any single military operation, but in the ongoing work of healing the quiet battles fought in American homes. She'd searched for recognition from people who couldn't understand her worth, only to discover that her real value lay in helping others find the recognition they deserved. The woman who'd been invisible in her own family had become a beacon of hope for thousands of others, proving that sometimes the greatest service happens not on distant battlefields, but in the space between hearts that are learning to understand each other.